Our first panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Paul Toyne. Paul has had an extremely distinguished career in sustainable built environment. After leadership roles in Balfour Beatty and WSP, he has gone on to a distinguished consulting career. He's on the Mayor of London's Sustainable Development panel. He is on the Green Construction Board, and he is also, in the context of GCDN, works with Grimshaw, the architectural practice, who are associate members of GCDN. And I can think of no one better to facilitate a discussion about a critical issue of our age, the climate crisis, and whether cultural districts have responsibilities, what the nature of those responsibilities are, and how they can be realistically executed. So Paul, thank you for doing this. Thank you for agreeing to it. And I'll leave to you the introduction of your stellar panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adrian. And great to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. What I thought I would do was just kind of put things into context a little bit in terms of why me and Grimshaw first. So, you know, Grimshaw are a global architecture and urban designer. We have a history of working in cultural districts, whether in helping showcasing art, creating event venues, or crafting a new set of piece of the city. You know, Grimshaw understands that experiences at cultural destinations need to strike a balance of grandeur and simplicity. We know too that these districts should actively contribute to discourse, quality of life, and a sense of place without overwhelming their surrounds or exhibits. And indeed, our work across the globe evidence this knowledge, whether it's transforming a disused clay pit into the Eden Project, or responding to the harsh desert climates of Dubai at the Permanent Sustainability Pavilion. Grimshaw has experience in resolving these complex site constraints and client requirements to turn them into vibrant urban quarters. Ongoing work of ours also showcases the importance of creating unique and functional places with a civic role. Currently, we are transforming a disused airfield near Bristol in southwest England into a new cultural district capable of hosting major sporting concerts and large-scale exhibitions. And indeed, our expanding global portfolio includes 2 cultural projects in Turkey, the newly opened Arta Gallery, which forms a new cultural hub in Istanbul, and the ongoing new museum building for Sadberg Hamin as part of a mixed-use master plan to regenerate a former industrial area of coastline into a new set piece for the city. We've also a number of projects in North America, notably the renovation and expansion of Queens Museum in New York and the Frost Museum of Science in Miami, as well as the proposed 21,000 square foot Santa Monica College of Art complex. So we believe really in enhancing the built environment through the design, and we have this experience, but we also now need to consider the climate emergency. And it's really important, and it's great to be part of today's discussion, because we need to see leadership in all organisations. So from a Grimshaw perspective, and this is very much the work that I'm involved in, we've made commitments, signing declarations around not just a climate emergency, but a biodiversity crisis. We've also signed up to science-based targets, which commits us to a 50% reduction in our own carbon emissions by 2030. And indeed, we're just about to announce that all our operations for 2020 will be carbon neutral, with carbon offsetting really the last resort. But the most important thing really is how we can influence and support our clients through our own designs. So to that effect, we've made the commitment that all our designs by 2025 will be net zero carbon ready. And indeed, we need to move into social and regenerative designs by 2030. And the reason why is, if you look on the graph on the right-hand side, we have a real challenge in our communities. Regardless of the pandemic, and indeed it has had an impact on carbon emissions, but it's only probably been 8 or 9% reduction in annual greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, all the signs for this year have seen that our carbon emissions are actually going to be greater than they were in 2018 and 2019. So we're actually on a business as normal trajectory, but we actually need to be going in completely the opposite direction. And we need to have a halving of emissions by 2030, getting down to net zero carbon by 2050, and moving into net negative emissions. And this is whereby we are taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of our environment. So it's really important to show some leadership. We're attempting to do this by committing and to our own targets and be opening about that. But equally, it's important that we have the ability to discuss and consider all aspects of the built environment, and not least cultural districts. And so today, to do that and to help us to explore what actions can be undertaken by cultural districts, we've got a group of panelists, who's just 3, which I'm delighted to be moderating. We've got Bert Detterman, who's co-founder of the 7 Square Endeavour, and Helen Kearney, who's project manager for the City of London, and Sari Mayesley, who's head of partnerships for Salford Culture and Place and Partnership. And what we're proposing to do is we're going to hear from each of them. Then we're going to start a discussion, and we'd very much like you to contribute too. So we've got the opportunity to take questions from you. So if you kindly please use the chat facility, we'll endeavour to get your questions and ask the panelists. So what I'd like to do now is to stop sharing and hand over to Bert Detterman, who's the co-founder of 7 Square Endeavour. Over to you, Bert. Let's find out what you've been doing to tackle the climate emergency.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Good day, everybody, wherever you are around the world. My name is Bert Detterman. I'm from the Netherlands, from Rotterdam, and I'd like to present a bottom-up project, which is quite interesting, I think. It's a combination of an association of a square in the center of Rotterdam and 7 Square Endeavour, which is a sustainability project. So I've been the director of operations for a long time in the municipal theatre in the center of Rotterdam, and I'll share my screen to give you some impression on what that looks like. Yep. So the city of Rotterdam, a square which was redesigned in 1997 by a quite famous architecture bureau, which is even, the design of it is even in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But people in Rotterdam either like it or hate it. It's one way or the other. There's never an in-between way. On the square, there's a theater, there's a cinema, and there's a concert hall. And because all people walking around the square were every now and then complaining about the surface, or about it being slippery, or about too hot or too dull, we together, the cultural institutions, went to the municipality. We had a congress, and we say, you really have to do something about your square. It's our doorstep. It's slippery. People don't like it. And then the municipality, the alderman, said, well, it's your square also. So why don't you do something about it yourself and do something as a combination of cultural institutions to take responsibility for the public space. So at that time we were inspired by Imagine 2020, Burning Ice, a tipping point, which has been in London at the time. And that also called for sustainability in combination with programming. So theaters or cultural institutions should consider programming that would enhance the sustainability by making people aware. That was about 2007, I think, and then we took it very literally. We started programming the square, which would at that time looked like this. And we started by placemaking. So in the early years, this is in the 60s, already placemaking had been taken place around the square. There were even plans to make it very sustainable at that time. It's a long time ago. But at this moment, it looks like this. After years of successful programming and having now about 180,000 dedicated visitors for events on the square, We together with the government, we tried to change the surface by making it like what we call a flying grass carpet. It's artificial grass, which is as a kind of pop-up installation on the square. And it turned out that this hugely changed the appreciation of people on the square and being outside there. You can easily sit down. It's palpable. It feels very comfortably. So the flying grass carpet for us was a way of having our programming on the square made more comfortable for people to enjoy it. Bigger events are being organized. And the interesting thing is that this all started by the initiative of the cultural institution. So it's totally a cultural driven project. The municipality dared us to take responsibility for the public space, and we said, okay, so how do we do this partnership? And they say, well, if you put effort in it and you do programming, we'll match it in euros, the effort. So together we can create public space on the square. And at this moment, this even takes us so far that for permits on organizing stuff on the square, our association now is part of taking the decision whether or not to do a permit on the square. So we are together with the municipality, we are in charge of whatever happens on the square, which is quite a far-fetching thing. We had, at some point, we thought we did programming on the square, always with the theme of sustainability and making people aware. But as a building, in our case, the theater, we thought, how can we be a sustainable building? And research made it clear that it wasn't possible to make a sustainable building unless you do it together. You cannot do it alone. You have to take in the whole neighborhood around you and combine initiatives in order to get a sustainable building, or in our case, a sustainable square. This is a rendering, so it's not actually, but indeed, we're already coming a long way to organize this. And to get that done, we initiated, as the association, we initiated 7 Square Endeavour. Our ambition was quite big. The first of 7 squares is our own square. We have the ambition to be leading, sustainable, inclusive, cultural. But the interesting thing is that we interested market partners to join us. So there's a big energy company to join. There's the Water Board of the Netherlands. There's the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. There are construction companies, engineering companies, and they all participate in this in-kind project, which we also put money in for doing the research, trying to make the whole square and its environment green. And green has to be taken literally. We are looking for wind energy. We're looking for water storage. We're looking for more green roofs and green pieces on the square. So at this point, we are quite far coming from being an association programming for awareness to also taking into account that we should really make it a sustainable project. And at that point, we thought we worked on 3 plans: a plan for public space, a plan for water, and a plan for energy. All the 3 plans are by this time are done, and they are being engaged as we speak. One of the complications is that this is actually not a square, but it's a roof of a parking lot, which complicates the possibilities on the square, of course, because there's ever so much possible for having a weight on the surface of the square. And it's not very easy, for instance, to plant trees, or because it's a roof. As the roof seems to be leaking, when we 14 years ago said to the government, do something about your square, and they threw us, they dared us to take responsibility ourselves. At this point, when the municipality said we had to take off the roof and make it a new roof, we said, okay, now we dare you. We've been working on this for 14 years. You cannot change the roof and change the whole square without taking us into account and without us being a formal partner in the process of getting this realized. They took that serious, and we have now been working for 2 years on a plan for the remodeling of the square, which, as an impression, looks like this. And the interesting thing is that it's now part of one of the big 7 projects that are being realized within the borders of Rotterdam. This is one of them. So starting from an initiative from cultural institutions, that were just thinking, do something about the square. We ended up in being now a formal partner in this big project, which is about 23 million invested in public space. So the processes which are important to keep into mind if you want to try an adventure like this is that we have always been very successful by being cultural driven. It's non-suspect. Cultural institutions have quite a simple way to reach out for people true at heart, not with a marketing issue or not with a market issue. And we managed to get organized quite quickly together with the cinema and together with the concert hall. We now have all the inhabitants around it in our association, as well as the entrepreneurs, as well as market partners that own, for instance, the building. You have to involve the municipal government in a fair way. This is always very difficult to do. You have to find a way of operating with them, and it's really important to keep in mind that small steps and patience are the key words in doing a process like this. As I always say, if you plant a tree, you probably will not live to see it fully grown. These projects take years and years, and you can only do it by small steps and choose your battles. So the best thing to do is to stay on top of the matter, make your partners complicit, and be prepared to give and take. For us, starting just from programming on our doorstep and taking the inside of our buildings out and motivating people to come and enjoy our square has led to a pop-up square that is now operating in a very, very successful way, and has changed via our 7 Square Endeavour project that aims to get the square carbon neutral in 2030. Is now changed and has been given the possibility of a major infrastructural change of 23 millions, and in which we are really a partner. So we'll probably later on we'll talk on some more ways of seeing how you actually can try to realize a project like this.
That's wonderful, Bert. Thank you ever so much for that. I just wonder if I might just ask you a question, just following on from what you were describing about your lessons learned and the insights. So you started off with the 1 square, and now you're looking for 6 others. What has been the main learnings from that process? What would be the war story? What would be the guidance you'd give to others if they were embarking on a similar project?
The worst part actually is to find the correct partner. So there's squares are relatively easy to find. A lot of cities have a sustainable goal, and every city claims to be a cultural city. So you would say that you have the 2 aspects that will be easy to create a project like this. But then if you talk to the director of a theater, that's just the director of a theater. If you talk to an alderman, it's just an alderman. So getting organized in a group of people that are really of the same way of thinking on how you should take into how to start a project like this is quite difficult. We are working together with La Marina in Valencia in Spain, which is actually you can compare it to our project. Our project is totally bottom up. So it started with the cultural institutions, the inhabitants joined, they organized parties on the square. And in Valencia, for instance, it's a top down. So the people who own the building start the project because they want more money out of it. And then it's hard to work from bottom up to get your cultural and your public aspects in the project as well. So I would always try to start bottom up and find a team that can create a project like this.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm sure we're going to be discussing collaboration and partner selection with the other panelists. But I was just wondering, how significant and important is it now that you're selecting partners that have the climate emergency and taking climate action as, part of a number of issues they're seeking to tackle?
Well, the interesting thing is that it's actually, I have to admit that perhaps it started for some partners a little bit of greenwash. You know, they thought, oh, this is a nice public place and it has a lot of spin-off, and so let's join. But then in the end, they found out that it is really a good pilot project, and once they started it, they cannot easily jump out of it also. So we have them by the tail, so to speak. We have them into our project, and this is the way we try to keep them.
Fascinating. And you know, in terms of getting to carbon neutral by 2030, is that for all 7 squares? And
No.
aside from, no, just the one, or
just the one. We are focusing on the one, and we're trying to find partners. But the stadium in which those other projects are, we don't even have 7 yet. But the stadium in which those projects are differ so much that we cannot be shoulder to shoulder and do it all 7 at the same time. But we like to be the pilot and the inspirator, although the crisis have limited our possibilities over the last year and a half, as for everyone, of course. But that's,
sure,
that's a complication.
Well, thank you, Bert. We're going to bring you back in when we have the panel discussion. But I just want to say, you know, a really fascinating presentation, and thank you so much for your contribution. And with that, now I'd like to move on to Helen Kearney, who's the project manager at the City of London in the UK. Over to you, Helen. Let's hear about what you've been up to and how you're tackling the climate emergency.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you, Bert. That was really, really fascinating, and I think has a lot of lessons for the project that I'm just about to talk about, because you're much further down the road. We're really at the very beginning. So I will share my screen and we'll see something that is a little earlier on. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm Helen. I work for the City of London Corporation as a project manager in the Public Realm team. And I'm here today to talk to you about a particular project, which is the Smithfield Public Realm project. So just by way of introduction, the Public Realm team, as you can imagine, we work on construction projects in the city. I've got an image here of a very typical sort of project that we worked on. So this is actually an area around St Paul's Cathedral in central London, an area that used to be a coach park that's now a new green space. So it's this type of project. We'll tend to work on kind of road closures and transforming spaces. And for those who aren't aware, when I talk about the City of London, I'm not talking about London as a whole. The city is really only the area that's in the red sort of circle here. So it's just one part of London. It's central London. It's the oldest, sort of most historic part of London, and it's traditionally the business and sort of financial services centre. That at least was until recently, when there was a partnership that was created of a number of cultural partners in the area, in the sort of northwest part of the city. So this partnership was between the Museum of London, the Barbican Centre, the London Symphony Orchestra and Guildhall School. And they came together to form a partnership called Culture Mile, which is really all about kind of shifting the economy of that part of London to be a sort of cultural focused, so lots of creative industries, and really kind of build on the strength of those different organisations. And as part of that, Public Realm comes into play. At first, it was very much a kind of partnership, that sort of bottom-up partnership between the different organisations. But the City of London became involved and started to realise that it wasn't just about that sort of creative partnerships, but it was about the place itself. And so Public Realm became kind of quite a big issue. You can see why. This is our current Public Realm. So we have spaces like this. This is Beach Street Tunnel, which is a kind of very polluted tunnel that runs underneath the Barbican Centre. That's actually one of our main pedestrian routes. And the other part of the area looks a bit like this. There's a major meat market in the area that has around it kind of very wide roads, lots of hard landscaping, lots of big lorries running through the area. So overall, it's not a particularly pedestrian friendly environment. But we're looking to change that. So we recently wrote a Public Realm strategy, which sets out our sort of vision for the area. So that includes lots of new green spaces, a real shift to pedestrian focus, public art, and so on. We're also working on a lot of temporary projects at the minute, and these really are about kind of testing our sort of different strategies for improving the area. They're about kind of raising awareness of the changes that have come, engaging with our communities, and developing those partnerships as well that are in the early days, but I think really crucial to this project. So that's kind of Culture Mile. I'd say that's been going on for a couple of years, and then the city also last year, I think, produced something called the Climate Action Strategy. So this is really where the project starts to relate to climate change and climate resilience. So the city has committed to a set of achievements that it would like to make. You can see them on the slide here. And as well as that, there's a set of actions that back up these particular commitments. So there are actions to support the achievement of net zero, actions to champion sustainable growth, and actions to build climate resilience. Now, these are obviously sort of top-down targets, but each of the different projects in the area really have to respond to that. So we've got this kind of top-down climate action strategy that the city would like to see across the whole organisation. And we've got this partnership between the different cultural organisations. Oh, sorry. Bear with me 1 second. So then we've got the Smithfield Public Realm project. So as you can see here, Smithfield is this area in kind of purpley blue on the slide. It's about a half of the Culture Mile area. It's sort of near Barbican, Farringdon and St Paul's. And importantly, it's an area where there are a lot of big historic meat market buildings. Some of them are derelict, some of them are still meat trade, although there is an aim to remove the meat trade from this area out of central London, and then those buildings will be transformed into cultural buildings. So the area will change quite significantly. The Museum of London is going to move into some of the buildings down there. And so we commenced the Smithfield Public Realm project, which is all about transforming the public spaces around those buildings and to kind of really prepare it for a future where there'll be many, many more visitors to the area. And we have a set of outcomes for the project. I'm not going to read them all, but they kind of range from sort of, cultural spaces to community spaces. But there is one particular outcome, which is at the bottom here, which is that the public realm is designed to be a leading exemplar for sustainable design. So that includes circular economy principles, includes incorporating water management and urban greening, and that the hard and soft landscaping is climate resilient. So we've been working on this project now for about a year. We've been working with architects Hawkins Brown, who've got a sort of team of designers working for them as well, including landscape architects. And over the course of the last year, we've come up with this vision and concept for the public spaces in Smithfield that completely transforms them from very, very vehicle-dominated hard landscaping to a much more active, much more cultural place, which really focuses on local community. It focuses on history of the area, because it's very, very rich in history, and on culture. And it aims to be inclusive. So we've used that statement that Smithfield will be a place for all Londoners. And in terms of climate resilience, although we're only at concept design stage, we've been thinking quite carefully about this. So you can see here a sort of summary of the type of measures that we're looking at. So the first and most important really is a reduction in motor vehicles, which will drastically reduce CO2 and emissions and improve air quality. And we'll also have the knock-on effect of improving pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. We're also looking at managing heat risk through increase in planting and tree canopy coverage. And increased planting will, of course, then enhance biodiversity, bring in new habitats. We also have an issue with flood risk in this area. So we're looking to reduce flood risk through things like sustainable urban drainage. And lastly, we're looking at a circular economy approach in terms of reuse of materials. So transportation has a really key role to play in all of this. We're using something called a healthy streets approach, which designs streets really on the basis of what their impact on the health and well-being of people is. So much reduced traffic, much increased space and greenery along the streets. As I said, we're also looking to increase planting. we're thinking a lot about cultural infrastructure and how do we create social spaces and really think about kind of social sustainability alongside environmental sustainability. And we're really thinking about historic environment as well. This is a very, very old part of London, and there's lots and lots of materials that are actually underneath the surface here. So can we use any of these? Can we kind of think about the historic cobbles and the granite sets that are there and reusing them? So we're not bringing in new materials, and also having a benefit of looking at the historic significance of these materials as well, and how they can help people experience the sites. And lastly, we're very conscious that we're sort of at the beginning of our process, really, and that other people really know a lot more about this than we do. So one of the key things that we're looking at doing over the next few months is actually a research project. So hopefully we'll be working with the GCDN on this to think about understanding best practice in this area, what innovative new ideas are out there, and what sorts of things, in fact, like what we've learned from Bert already actually today, can we talk to practitioners in this area and really inform the Smithfield project as it's in its early days, and how we can then implement the climate action strategy. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Here to kind of conclude is an image of Smithfield that I showed earlier, and an image of what we're trying to create. So you've got the kind of mirror image there. So you've got an area that shifts from being very hard landscaping, vehicle focused, to being very welcoming, green, and very community focused. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Helen. That was fascinating. And, given, where you are on the stage of your project, which is, quite significantly behind where Bert was and what they've been doing with their square. But I was just wondering, how easy is it to find the kind of collaborations and partnerships partners that you need to get that advice to deliver all those different, multi-dimensional kind of approaches, creating a great place, but also taking on board the climate emergency. How do you go about that?
In terms of partnerships?
Well, I'm just thinking about, is it a challenge? Is it an issue? Or is everybody knocking on your door saying, we know stuff and you need to hear from us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of both, in truth, because we have, I'm sure this is the same everywhere. When you're working with cultural partners, which we are, obviously Culture Mile is a partnership, and everybody in terms of the programmers there, have hundreds of different ideas and really, really enthusiastic. And it's actually fantastic as a sort of public realm practitioner to work in this environment where you've got, where you're working with cultural partners. It is very distinct. But what I would say is, on the other side, you have a lot of technical experts who are saying quite different things and kind of raising real issues about the constraints and the challenges of this. And I think the key kind of constraint really for us is all around this point about being one of the oldest districts in London. And what we're doing effectively is retrofitting an area that's had layers and layers and layers of history kind of embedded on top of it in this kind of urban space. So an example of how this impacts is that obviously what we'd love to do is loads and loads of planting in the area. But when you look below the surface, I showed you those pictures of those historic cobbles. We have that as like the layer below the tarmac, but then below that we have railway tunnels, or we have the basements of the meat market, which themselves are listed. So we've got lots of listing constraints as well. And we've got loads and loads and loads of power and utilities. So there's, you get a radar survey back for this area, and it's this multicolored kind of mass. And it's very, very difficult to say, oh yeah, we can find an area here where we can do lots of planting. So the technical constraints are actually really, really difficult with this, I would say. So yeah, if anyone's got kind of experience of working in that really, really congested underground environment, that's the sort of thing that I think would be interested to hear about. And yeah, I'd say there's also, not to kind of go on about challenges, but there is also a sort of cultural challenge as well. Although the cultural partners are very interested in climate resilience and sustainability, this is still very much a working part of London, and we have to kind of shift toward this point about pedestrianisation, which is, I think in London and probably elsewhere, I'm sure, is a very political, question. We've tried to pedestrianise sections of London before, and it's not always gone the way that we wanted to. And I think there's still a way to go in terms of changing people's mindsets. You know, we have a very good public transport. We do have a lot of cars on the road still. We do have a lot of vehicles, and shifting to pedestrianisation will require a real kind of cultural shift that is slow and has been slow so far. So yeah, a number of challenges.
Well, yes, and I'm sure there'll be some unexpected challenges that come about through further exploratory work, particularly, you know, what's beneath the ground.
Yeah.
And for someone who's actually sitting in an office in Farringdon, probably less than a quarter of a mile away from Smithfields, I'm going to be fascinated to follow your progress on that project. And we're going to bring you back later, Helen, to participate. But just a note out for the audience, do please, if you've got questions to Bert or Helen from their presentations, do use the Q&A facility or indeed the chat room, and please pose your question. And in the meantime, while you're thinking about that question, let me introduce Sari Mayer-Slee, who is the Head of Partnerships for Salford Culture and Place. So welcome, and over to you. Let's get the first slide up, and over to you.
Thank you. And thanks to GCDN colleagues, my laptop decided not to start working today when I did. So working off my phone, and yeah, thank you. If we start, the screen to begin with, instead of looking at one specific cultural district, as Paul kindly introduced, we have, I work for the city of Salford, which sits in the greater Manchester City region in Northern England. Our partnership, rather than having one cultural district, we have three. The image that you see in front of you is Media City, which sits in our established cultural district at Salford Quays, which used to be the Manchester ship docks, went down the Manchester Ship Canal to Liverpool, and was a major trade route for moving goods. And in around the turn of the millennia, cultural-led regeneration formed a new part of Salford. If we go to the next slide, so we have noted in pink there, we have an established cultural district at Salford Quays, but to give you a sense of the geography of the city, the grey bit is Manchester and Manchester City Centre, and you see around us sort of gold coloured. We have our next emerging cultural district, which, if you will, sits alongside Manchester City Centre, with lots of green spaces around the University of Salford Central Campus, and a hugely changing part of the city. But then in about 5 years down the road, you'll see there's a little green shape, which is RHS Bridgewater, a garden that opened last week. It's the RHS's 5th garden. It's only urban garden, the only garden it's ever built from scratch. So, but that and a part of the city that's much more rural, both agriculture and but also green spaces, canals, walkways, woodlands, things like that. We're looking at how we might form a horticultural district around that. So rather than focusing on public realm, it's been fantastic to hear both Bert and Helen look at the cityscape, the fabric of the city itself. But I'll be talking about sort of a collection of things that we're doing across the city around climate response. If we can go to the next slide, the first area is really looking at climate awareness, and a couple examples in terms of programming and commissioning around climate awareness for visitors, local residents, and people enjoying and experiencing the cultural districts. So Quays Culture, which is based at Salford Quays and is a partnership model, they're commissioning later this year Jerram to create a floating earth installation in the water. It will be part of the annual Light Waves Festival, light focused digital festival that draws lots of visitors, thousands of visitors to the area. And will float in the water, internally illuminated, and the 10-meter globe itself was created from high-resolution NASA imagery. There's an installation that has surround sound musical tracks, and the artwork, the whole focus of it is to highlight the problem of climate change as a major threat to, well, our world, our civilization, both now and in the future. But the artwork also acts as a mirror to major events in society, and in light of the current pandemic, it seeks to provide the viewer with a perspective of our place on the planet, our interconnectedness, our responsibility towards one another, and after the lockdown, our kind of joined, renewed respect for nature, that this commission is really responding to that. Going on to the next slide, another example in terms of programming or commissioning in terms of climate awareness, how we work with our visitors and the people with whom we have a relationship. in terms of cultural enjoyment or experience. In the UK, over the last 2 years, there's been quite a focus on FestivalUK 22, which will commission 10 huge events across the UK, across the 4 developed nations, and Walk the Plank, which is one of the UK's leading outdoor arts company, but is based in Salford, first had a ship on the Manchester Ship Canal before any of the regeneration had started happening. And it's been behind memorable events such as the Liverpool City of Culture opening, Commonwealth Games opening. So they do some fantastic large-scale spectacular events, but also are really committed to on-the-ground local work in Salford across a series of outdoor participatory programs. But they're part of one of the 10 Festival 22 programs under the title of Green Spaces, Dark Skies. And they are working with a series of partners, including National Parks UK, the Landscapes for Life, which is the UK's areas of outstanding natural beauty, and their project, which will, again, really focusing on huge mass participation with sites across the 2022, but also the UK. We'll experiment with lighting technology, environmental science, mass participation, geo-tracking, and really exploring the beauty of the UK's outdoors while asking questions about access, climate, landscape, and what the future of public spectacle is. So 2 just examples of things that are happening in the city from a programming around climate awareness. If we can go to the next slide, I wanted to give a couple of examples in terms of climate action. So within Greater Manchester is a city region which has devolved power and responsibility for 10 local authorities in that part of Northern England. I think 2 years ago, they made a pledge to be carbon neutral as a city region by 2038. And as you might imagine, there are a series of policies and projects that are trying to take that big idea and figure out how to make it happen. One of them is called the Ignition Project, which is really aiming to develop a series of green solutions for urban cityscapes around rain gardens, street trees, green roofs and walls, but also looking at innovative financing solutions that can make it happen and happen quickly. But within this, it's not a cultural project in conception at all. And as it kicked off a couple of years ago, the University of Salford, which is one of the anchor partners of our Culture in Place partnership, signed up to be a living lab and to build green walls, 2 raid gardens, and on their main campus, close to Manchester City Centre, sitting between arts and engineering buildings. Well, they built these at quite a speed over the pandemic. And then as students whose work was practice-based, returned or were allowed to stay, if you will, not on Zoom or Teams or other software, but be live. That area in terms of the green space, the Ignition living lab space, became the focal point for, oh my goodness, live events, pop-up events, films, and it really became the focus in terms of cultural programming for students. And now coming out of, well, hopefully coming out of the pandemic lockdown and continuing to open up over 21 and 22. That now is a space in terms of the programming for New Adelphi Theatre. So sometimes, in terms of climate action, it doesn't need to start with culture, but having an openness in terms of how space can be animated and shared. And again, in this case, just the situation between an arts building and an engineering building. Going on to the next slide, another example is through another partner in Greater Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, who I am not going to try to read out the long acronym, but is involved with a EU-funded program called CIRMAP, and they're working with, I think, 7 other universities across Europe to look at how you can use recycled concrete aggregate from demolished buildings through new forms of 3D printing to create street furniture. Well, MMU in early stages of the program approached Salford City Council in terms of how they might work with them on a brief for the public realm and cityscape. And actually, working with a partnership, they came back to say, instead of creating street furniture, planters and benches, we'd really love to look at sculpture instead. And coming out of COVID and the life people lived through this time, to look at something called the Spirit of Salford, which was an initiative that grew to basically people coming together in the city to help the most marginalized and disadvantaged. And where we've landed really is to create a central sculpture, if you go to the next slide, on the lawns of our town center, the Civic Centre, but also to have that main central sculpture to have 5 separate sculptures that would then be co-created in neighborhoods around the city, situated in parks and places where COVID had either really been devastating in terms of lives and livelihoods, or in areas of the city where the community's response was particularly motivated or strong. So really trying to take commemoration, celebration, and co-creation and marry them with really circular economy approaches to creating public realm pieces and street furniture. So again, two examples that are really around climate action, but didn't start with culture, but made space to see how we can create something that's more than the sum of its parts. And then the final small example, it really comes on to activity, and rather than just looking at climate action specifically on its own, to also bringing climate, social, and creative action to a single project. And I won't go too deeply into this, but we've started a scheme that will be happening in 22 and 23 that takes the concept of the garden city and rethinks it through partners, Be More Pirates, as I said, of what rules do we want to break, restart, and particularly looking at community leadership and youth leadership and how to make this, if you will, manifest in our shared parts of our city. I'll stop there, but just gives us sort of a smattering in terms of what we've been planning in terms of the way that we're working in Salford, both in the cultural districts, but also across the city.
Fascinating. Thank you ever so much for sharing that. I'm sure there's other projects you'd be wishing to highlight, but it made me wonder. So, you know, through public engagement, through the academics like Salford and Manchester Metropolitan, you're doing research. I just wondered, is there any way that you're driving the behaviours in how you do these installations and engagement into, you know, reducing the carbon emissions through those types of operations? Because it's not just about getting people to get the message and take action, but how is that whole value chain that is supplying those events for you? How are they tackling the climate emergency? And is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, in different, I would say yes. But yes, if you will, of what I know in the partnership. I know, for example, the Jerram piece, the huge globe that they not only looked at the sustainability of the fabric and the materials going in, but how then that fabric would then be made into clothing after the installation was broken down. I guess what I would say overall is, you know, are all parties on board? I don't know, but I will say in terms of the way that we're working in the city, you know, just before the pandemic, we launched a new cultural strategy. And I mean, 2 working days before the UK's Prime Minister kind of got on our television and said, okay, this is here, and everything was shut by that Friday. But the strategy was based on a value rather than a series of outcomes. And it meant that as all of our worlds have been turned upside down, having that common ground be value-based rather than asset-based or outcome-based has changed the ways of working. So the question is not just what should we do or when should we do it, but what is the good that we're trying to do? What are the real challenges that we face? And I think in terms of, if you will, I've given you kind of a scattergun approach, a bunch of small things that are happening. In some ways, you know, to draw from Naomi Klein's book, No is Not Enough. You know, if you don't like the way things are happening now, trying to protest that will slow things down, she suggests, but it won't stop it. You have to come up with another solution. And whilst there are a series of issues we have to be facing now in terms of, you know, social justice, educational impact, all these things, the climate emergency won't wait. So we have to be taking more intersectional responses, either taking a climate-focused activity and plussing it with other positive outcomes, and then imagining the activity that's going to reach that. That climate has to be part of everything that we do, because as you so clearly stated and showed in your introduction, it simply won't wait for us to catch up or figure out how. We have to embed it in everything that we do. And I think whilst the partnership work in Salford is it allows us to do more than one thing at a time. It also guarantees that whether they're public, private, third sector, artist-led sector, educational sector, that everybody is working towards those same goals.
Thanks very much for that. And if I may, I'd like to explore that a bit further with both Helen and Bert. So, Sari mentioned shared values and having, alignment around some key issues. And clearly today, our focus is the climate emergency. I just wonder, what degree of agency do we believe cultural districts have in driving that? And is it through a procurement strategy, which I think came over quite clearly with Helen's presentation? But I just wondered, is that what mechanisms do you have in your power to help influence others to drive the same shared value? So what is your approach? For example, let's just go over to Bird, in Rotterdam with the one square. How have you managed that?
Well, it's in order to be able to create a coalition of the willing with unlikely partnerships, because that's what you look for. Somebody has to take the lead. So you cannot be at a round table and go around all the time, which is a sign of the times every now and then. But somebody has to say, okay, so I'm going to do this. I'll just jump into it. Give me this problem and I'll solve it. In our case, these were the cultural institutions driven by the spirit of Imagine 2020 at that time, and Burning Eyes and Tipping Point, which was for us was really inspiring. We created, as soon as possible, we created a small office for production and programming, and that the office was driven by people that live around the square. So we hired people who live around the square to look outside our window and see what's happening. If there was any trouble, call out for the police. If people had questions, where to ring a bell. If something was going to happen, they spread around folders in every letterbox. So we started all very small, and these steps take a long time, as I said earlier. But then the basis then is the humus layer. It's very big for a project like this. But in the installation of a small office with a programmer and a production manager living on the square, seeing what's happening, for us that was, which is a 24/7 office. You can always send an email or do a telephone call or just ring a bell, and that makes it very reachable, so to speak, for people. And for us, that was really a good decision to do.
But do you think that relying on goodwill is sufficient? And if not, what are the powers that you have or mechanisms that you can use to drive the change that you think is necessary?
Well, if you organize goodwill, you can force the municipality. That's a handy tool. If usually it's the other way around, the municipality wants something or market partners want something, and they have to push it, shove it through by the people that live there, and they are annoyed by all the activities that take place for construction and whatever, and they feel left out of making plans and programs. And if you start it the other way around, then you get something to go to the politicians and say, this is what we were, and we is the entrepreneurs, it's the building owners, but it's also the people that live there. And if you want to make a cycle path here instead of a motorway, we are in favor, and we will take care that nobody will object to that. So we are taking away some trouble from the municipality by being proactive and organize it ourselves.
Yeah, so there's a lot of community engagement and stakeholder responses involved in that. So let's go over to Helen. So who's leading who? Is it just goodwill? Is there political will? What's happening in your cultural mile?
I think, I mean, obviously, as I've sort of set out, that ours is sort of earlier days, but I would say that in our case, there was a couple of kind of key shifts. I talked in my presentation about the climate action strategy, which is the sort of top down. So that's when the city itself is saying, right, we're going to impose ambitions now and targets. But the more kind of bottom up approach to this, which is the partnership between the different institutions in Culture Mile, I would say was really galvanized actually through the experiences that we've had with COVID in the last 18 months now. And I would say that, understandably, the Museum of London and the Barbican and so on, they're sort of major national institutions, and they spent a lot of time really thinking about a sort of global audience. And during COVID, really started to reach out to much more local communities, and they've started to work a lot closer now with those local communities, not just in the sort of direct neighbourhood, but in London. And I would say in the local area have started to act almost as a kind of almost like broker between different communities. So an example of this is that we've worked on something called the Fusion Prize, which is a prize that was awarded for funding to a kind of skills development agency that's run by very young people, so sort of late teens, early 20s. And what that group have done is put together, again, a sort of skills development program where different mentors who are very young people then mentor a group of very young, diverse young people who are interested in culture. And through that project, they've actually expressed an interest in climate change. And so Culture Mile was able to broker a relationship between that group of young people who are in this skills development program and a local developer. And the developer's got a site that isn't going to be developed for a couple of years, and they're together going to work on creating a new community garden. And that's something that's come about because of that sort of initial program led by Culture Mile, but also this ability to kind of broker those relationships locally. And I'd say that that's something that, you know, Culture Mile is sort of on the ground, you know, it's housed in those areas, so it's able to kind of make those connections, and they've got all the connections now with lots of different local businesses, and are able to kind of see where those connections are and those links, which is, I suppose, it's a sort of a form of community building, which is something that I think, you know, although we're a very old area, it is an area in transition, and it's moving away from this kind of traditional meat market sort of area to something else. And I think that that's all part of it, is building this kind of community around what is a sort of set of values. And coming from that, everybody seems to be very interested in climate change and wanting to do something. So we can use those skills as a sort of broker to bring a lot of that together, which I think probably would have happened anyway, is a sort of has been kind of catalyzed through what's happened with COVID, I would say.
So what I'm hearing from you, Helen, is that you know, in terms of the governance around your area, there is the political support and buy-in, both through the City of London, then you've got the GLA and the London Plan, then you've got, you know, the regional and national governments, and similarly you've got a similar situation, Sari, up in Manchester. But I was just struck by, you know, the comment that you were mentioning about how if you show you've got a coalition of willing people that can take a better management, let's say stewardship of that urban space, that can be quite influential in influencing politicians. I mean, did you find at the beginning that there were political barriers to what you were attempting to achieve, or were they kind of like institutional barriers with the different stakeholders, the people that, you know, who owns the car parking space, for example, in your project?
Well, it's not so much barriers as that it takes time to lure politicians to take over your view. It takes time for them to see the benefit of it. So if as I said earlier, we're a bottom-up project, so we in slow ways we're trying to creep up people and make them understand with slow force, so to speak. And so it takes some time, but at that point, and at some point the government changes, and one of the aldermen came to live on the square, you know, and he looked down on it, and so we were very happy with that. So it's also luck. Sometimes it's just stupid luck. An alderman living on your square and seeing that it's a popular one will help you immensely. So slow force and take your time. That's, for us, that always works.
But what happens then if you have changes in key political positions? Do you think, you know, does that then create a problem? You have to build up a relationship and a rapport with the, you know, the new party in power or the new politicians, and or have you gone through a cycle?
We have several even. But the advantage of Square Endeavour is that the government in general is committed to it. So if the government changes, they're already in it and they cannot step out. For the program of the square, that's always a risk. But for a project like that, no, they have, and the goals for the city itself are now aligning with things we started 14 years ago. So they have to do it anyway.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, now we've got a question that's come in from the audience, and it's for all three of you. And actually, I'm really glad that this question's been asked by Christos Karas who he's actually worded it better than I had when I was thinking about procurement strategies. So Christos's question is, it goes to scope 3 emissions. Now, these are the indirect emissions that happen within the built environment in cities. So that's the consumption of food and beverages, the suppliers that come in and light up your shows and do various things. So, you know, how are you tackling the scope 3 emissions generated by audiences and visitors coming to your districts? What measures have you got in place, and are there any strategies that can mitigate them? So it may be a bit unfair to ask Helen to comment on that because you're still in development, but so maybe you can go last, but maybe going over to Salford and to Sari, how are you managing this?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'm not sure if I have all the information to be able to respond to Christos's, I mean, great question in terms of, because there is an infrastructure at Salford Quays in terms of how Media City, which is owned by a private sector partner, Peel Media, parts of the land that are owned by Salford City Council, and parts of that are owned by individual businesses and organizations like the Lowry. There are strategies, and actually they are going through a new master planning process that has climate and people really at the center of it. But I don't have the detail. I can also say in terms of the emerging cultural district around another part of the city close to Manchester City Centre, they're also starting a 10 to 15-year master plan that has green elements at the start of it. But being honest, there's a placemaking strand, a social value strand, and a sustainability strand. And at this point, they're not platted together. So whilst I can say it's in the process, I don't think there is a joined up strategy in terms of those scope 3 emissions, the ongoing usage and what's created by our animations of the spaces. I think there are individual private, private, public, and third sector approaches in terms of partners at each district as a site rather than a place. But how those have joined together, I don't think we're there yet in Salford. And I'm sure I'll find out from colleagues quite shortly if I'm wrong.
But it is that bigger question, isn't it? You know, are cultural districts in a position to actually measure and thereby manage these emissions? And truly understand the hopefully positive contribution they can make in driving to that net zero carbon cultural district that I think most of us would like to see. So, Bert, just on that issue, do you track your
Yes.
greenhouse? You do, yeah?
Yeah, we actually do. That's part of our 7 Square plan to track that. So we have all the figures of that, and as a result of that, a larger part of the first level of the parking lot under the square is now changed into a bicycle parking with a special entrance to it. And we take out the circulation across the square as a whole, except for pedestrians and bicycles, so that we take out a part of the car movements in the city as well. So this is also a product of a longer negotiation between the government. It has also to do with the fact that for us, we have quite good public transport around, so that's an advantage on itself. But as a result of measurements, we could, because I won't take too long about it, but one part of the government says we need the income from parking. So street parking is expensive, car lots are expensive. We cannot take out for bicycles because the cars is much more money. And then we tried to start up a valet parking for bicycles. And that eventually turned into a parking lot for bicycles. But it took some time to make them see that there's a bigger picture than just money for parking. Yeah, that is a key word.
Yeah, you see, you raise a good point there. And with all of your districts, there are certain powers you don't control. So, for example, the transport strategy. So going to Helen's district, there's Transport for London, which is under the powers of the mayor. There are strategies up in Salford around low carbon transportation, but the change of pace and the transition is not controlled by the cultural district. So you may have, or you may want to see faster transition than is actually possible. So how do you cope with managing, those things that are that you don't have control of, and managing expectations with your partners or indeed people who come to visit. I mean, surely, Helen, that's something that you're going to have to encounter. What have you got in place to try and to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, it is like a sort of a very kind of complex question. And I think rather than kind of talk, in sort of umbrella terms, I'll give a couple of examples of the sorts of things that we're thinking about as part of the project. But what I would say is that in my presentation, I mentioned the climate action strategy, which has been produced by the city. And I think one element of that is quite interesting in regard to this question, because a number of the actions in that are around what the city itself can do. But there is a set of actions that are about the square mile as a whole. Now, obviously, the city is a landlord in the square mile, but it also has lots of buildings and activity that it doesn't control in the area as well. But it's committing to acting as a very strong advocate to move toward net zero as part of that strategy. So it does have a relationship with all of its tenants and with all the people that work in the city, and it's committing to actively working about climate resilience in that strategy. And I think the city does have a good sort of record in that regard, and it sees itself as a leader as well. So there's a lot of financial services in the city, and the city itself is committed to working toward green finance, for example. So it's sort of showing leadership in that respect. But anyway, back to the Smithfield project. I would say we're thinking a lot about the specificity of cultural places and about the infrastructure that cultural places need. So at the minute, when we close the road in Smithfield and we have a festival, we don't have any infrastructure for that festival. So everything gets brought in. So in the Public Realm project, we've got the ability to kind of build in that infrastructure so that nothing needs to be brought in. So clearly power is the main one. We don't want to see generators, across the site during a festival. So we can have power inbuilt into the streets and the buildings that's accessible for those festival organisers that is powered on green energy. We can implement things like we've got a zero emission street at the minute. So that horrible tunnel that I showed in the presentation, Beach Street, at the minute that's a zero emission street. So that, the aim there is to kind of implement streets like that across the area. It's very challenging, that particular type of implementation, I would say. And you also talked about procurement. I think that's something else we have now built issues around climate change into our procurement strategies. So again, specific to sort of cultural districts, or something we all tackle is we all work a lot with sort of temporary installations. And I think, a few years ago, we might have done some sort of temporary installation, some artwork, and maybe at the beginning not thought too carefully about what would happen to all the materials at the end. Whereas now, when we go through procurement and we go through artist competitions and so on, we do include questions and scoring around that kind of reuse of materials. So the idea is that an installation in Culture Mile will be reused somewhere else, or the materials will be reused somewhere else, or so on. So there's a few examples there of the sorts of things that we're thinking about.
That's really insightful. Thank you very much for that, Helen. I'm conscious of the time now. We've got about 5 minutes to go. I'm going to make an observation, which I'm not expecting an answers back from, and then I'm going to ask the final question. And my observation is that I would have loved this presentation and discussion to go on for probably another 15 minutes to really look at the issue of resilience and building adaptation into all of your cultural districts. Because unfortunately, we're already in a situation where climate change is upon us. And whilst we're mitigating, we also be thinking to the future. And I'm very much conscious of the words Helen used around, places don't stay still, they transition. And actually the forces that are going to be upon them, the physical forces, whether it's drought or heat waves, etc., precipitation, rainfall, etc., we need to be mindful of that. So that's I'm putting it out there, particularly for those in the audience, just to remember that we need to be thinking about climate resilience and building that into your districts. So I'm going to ask you, all three of you, just to dwell on what's missing. What would really help you deliver, particularly against the climate emergency? Is it access to better research? Is it tools? If so, what kind of tools? What's, looking from what you've learned thus far in your journeys, What's the bit that would have made it so much simpler? Is there anything that springs to mind? Is it a combination? Is it about that selection of partners, etc.? I mean, the reason I'm talking now is to give you a few moments to think about the question. I don't want to be too unfair, but I'm going to go to you, Sari. Thank you. What's missing very quickly? What would be the big ticket item that you would desire?
I think really openness to taking risks, because if we're going to innovate, there has to be allowance and acceptance of taking risk. If we simply do things the way that we accept they have been done, or we thought they should have been done 10 years ago, we will not make the change, and we won't make it at the pace that we need to. And I think if we recognize that what the pandemic has done globally is take our place-based economies and thrown all the norms either up in the air or out the window. Agglomeration doesn't work the same when things are digitally connected. There's been some great research coming out of the creative industries at PEC in the UK around what clusters really work and how they work across in different sectors in the creative industries. But I think when our place-based economies, in terms of face-to-face, people and places, are in flux, these are the moments to try things, because most innovation doesn't get it right the first time. And whilst in Salford, we have amazing political leadership, but a lack of resource and a strong risk aversion at times when things are so choppy and changey. I think that's the main thing. You need massive resource to do top-down massive innovation. So therefore, starting small and local, but doing it, working with a coalition of willing and building up. But those that are willing to take the risks and try things with really clear aims in mind and drawing on the research, it's that risk aversion for me is the missing, that is the main stumbling block to starting things that we can then connect to make something much stronger and unilateral, not across only our city, but our city.
And very quickly, yes or no, do you believe you've now got that attitude right and the risk takers within your project at Salford? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yep,
yes.
Okay, perfect.
Source to follow. Yeah.
That's a fantastic answer. Yeah. It's the one we wanted to hear. Brilliant. Okay, let's go to Bert. What's the one thing that you wish you had at the start or even now?
Well, the thing that blocks a lot of possibilities are the quite sturdy regulations of municipality. Rules and regulations are quite strict. And in projects like these, you want to make the assumption. You want to do something else. You want to try something new. And rules and regulations are sitting in the way often, and they take a lot of time to change. You can solve that by creating ownership, but ownership cannot be imposed. So you have to create ownership and see that everybody says, okay, in this case, we'll look at it differently. Otherwise, it's very difficult to realize things in a practical sense.
Absolutely, that's a fabulous answer as well. So we've got attitude, we've now got sort of like flexibility with rules and regulation. Helen, what would be your missing issue? And I'm going to have to ask you to answer quite quickly.
I think, like for me, and it links back to what I've said before about COVID and the changes in attitude, I think, that have happened. But I've talked a lot about kind of technical issues, greening and so on. But I think the one thing I would like to kind of close with is the point about resilience being not just an environmental issue, but a social issue. And I think that that's something that the city should be taking leadership in kind of bringing sort of a diversity of voices to this conversation. And I think that cultural districts really do have a real strength in being able to kind of bring communities and sort of really allow us of diversity of voices in this conversation.
That again is a really nice contribution, because I think, from my perspective, this social justice and making sure that we leave no one behind in the changes that we need to see, involving everyone to create the solution that we need, is super important, and something which we cannot understate. So with that, I would like to thank all three of you very much for your insights. It's been fabulous to learn from your interventions and what you're doing. I wish you lots of luck in realizing your ambitions there, and I hope those of you who've tuned in or are listening to this later as a podcast have found that really insightful and helpful. So for those of you who are participants, please join me and thank Bert, Sari and Helen. Thank you all very much for that. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Adrian.
Thank you. Bert, Sari, Helen, Paul, that was fantastic. That was exactly the sort of fantasy of a GCDN discussion, well informed about a topic which is of real common importance with lots and lots of takeaways. So deeply grateful. Thank you. That was wonderful. We are, I think, now going to take a break until 1:15 Central European time, which is to say 3/4 of an hour, when we are back with a session on Lugano itself. So thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.